She was a young model from Ukraine who traveled thousands of miles to the United States in pursuit of her dreams. She thought she had finally found love, a boyfriend who seemed to be everything she had hoped for. With their love blossoming and a new life ahead of them, she believed that happiness was finally within reach. But she could never have imagined that, just one night later, her life would come to a horrific end. What followed was a brutal and bloody murder. The crime scene was so horrifying and the killer's actions so ruthless that the case sparked widespread outrage. The sheer cruelty of the murder has been compared to some of the most disturbing true crime cases in history. It has even been described as one of the most brutal and heinous crimes ever committed in Los Angeles. So, what exactly happened that year? Why was the killer so merciless? Next, let's turn back the clock to 2016 and uncover the shocking details of this case. Los Angeles is a thriving city in southwestern California and the second-largest city in the United States. It is also a major financial and cultural center of California. Most people probably have a strong impression of Los Angeles because of the countless blockbuster movies produced by Hollywood. The city is widely regarded as the birthplace of Hollywood, where countless legendary films have been created and later spread across the world, influencing generations of filmmakers. The story we are about to tell took place in this bustling city, famously known as the City of Angels. The main character in this story was Lana Kazan, a 30-year-old model living in Los Angeles. She had deep-set eyes and long, dark hair. Lana was born on January 27, 1986, into an ordinary family in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. There is little information available about her childhood, but those who knew her described her as a quiet and well-behaved girl. From an early age, Lana was intelligent and quick-witted. Her parents placed high expectations on her, particularly when it came to education. They invested a great deal of time and effort in her studies, and Lana herself worked extremely hard. Eventually, she graduated with a law degree and began working at the State Tax Service of Ukraine, a stable position within a government agency. However, even during her university years, Lana harbored a passionate interest in fashion and the modeling industry. After all, Ukraine is well known for producing many beautiful women and successful models. The country's fashion industry provided a favorable environment for young women to enter the modeling world, especially those blessed with attractive features and a good physique. Despite the intense competition among models in Ukraine, Lana managed to achieve a certain level of success. With her experience and striking appearance, she gradually stood out on the runway and began building a name for herself. By all accounts, Lana could have continued living a comfortable and fulfilling life in Ukraine. Staying there and further developing her career would have been a perfectly reasonable choice. But Lana was not satisfied with that. Deep down, she dreamed of something bigger. She longed for a larger stage, greater opportunities, and a life filled with new challenges. And the destination of that dream was the United States. In 2014, at the age of 28, Lana finally made the decision to pursue the dream she had carried for years. She moved to the United States and headed straight for Los Angeles, a city widely regarded as the heart of the entertainment, film, and arts industries, a place that seemed perfect for advancing her modeling career. The sun-drenched beaches and bright sunshine of Los Angeles captivated her. Lana began to tell herself that this was where she wanted to stay, build a career, and eventually start a family. With years of experience on the runway behind her, she quickly found work as a model and gradually settled into her new career. There are also reports suggesting that she initially found work as a translator instead. Whatever the case may have been, Lana managed to establish a life for herself in Hollywood relatively quickly. But in her eyes, there was still one thing missing from the picture of her new life. A sweet and meaningful love. If Lana could find the Prince Charming she had always dreamed of, everything would be perfect. And then, unexpectedly, fate seemed to bring someone into her life. At a party, a man named Blake caught her attention. Wearing glasses and sitting quietly in a corner, Blake appeared reserved and somewhat detached from the people around him. But between the two of them, love quickly blossomed. They fell deeply in love and soon became a couple. Lana was very happy with Blake. He was not only wealthy, but also talented, caring, and deeply devoted to her. Not long afterward, the couple welcomed a beautiful baby girl named Diana. To help take care of the child, Lana invited her mother, Olga, to come from Ukraine to Los Angeles. To avoid interfering with the young couple's relationship, Olga rented an apartment near their home. For Lana, life seemed almost perfect. She had a loving fiancé who adored her, an adorable daughter, a home, a car, and financial security. Everything appeared to be falling perfectly into place. Their happy and peaceful life had only just begun. But then, something terrible happened. On May 25, 2016, a deep sense of unease began to overwhelm Olga. She suddenly found herself unable to contact her daughter. Lana would not answer her phone or respond to her messages. It was completely out of character. Worried that something might have happened, Olga asked a friend to accompany her to Lana's apartment on Holloway Drive in West Hollywood. They spotted Lana's car in the building's parking garage, but no matter how many times they knocked on the door, no one answered. From downstairs, Olga looked up toward the balcony and noticed someone inside the apartment. The person appeared to be a guest. Olga called out and asked them to open the door, but the person acted as though they could not hear her and eventually closed the window. With the situation becoming increasingly alarming, Olga had no choice but to call the police. 2 officers from the Los Angeles Police Department quickly arrived at the scene. After knocking on the door several times without receiving any response, the officers initially decided that they could not simply force their way inside. Instead, they contacted the building manager and obtained Blake's phone number. But when they called him, the call went straight to voicemail. No one answered. At that point, the police left the scene. Olga was now extremely worried and desperate for answers. She sent a message to her daughter. "Mommy loves you. Are you still alive? I've come to your apartment, but no one will open the door. Please answer me. I know he's keeping you there. I've already called the police." But Lana never replied. After waiting for some time with no response, Olga contacted the police again. This time, after knocking repeatedly and still receiving no answer, the officers began to realize that the situation could be far more serious than they had initially thought. The investigating officer discovered something particularly disturbing. There really was someone inside the apartment. Lana's phone had been used to order food online at 1:04 a.m. on May 25 and again at 3 a.m. on May 26. Surveillance cameras in the hallway also captured someone inside the apartment coming out to collect the food. It was extremely strange. Someone was clearly inside. So why had nobody answered when the police knocked repeatedly? Why was no one answering the phone? Neighbors also told investigators that they had not seen anyone coming in or out of the apartment for 2 days. Based on the clues provided by Olga, Lana's mother, the police began to suspect that Blake might have done something terrible to Lana inside the apartment. There was no time to waste. The officers urgently requested a spare key from the building management. But when they tried to unlock the door, they discovered that it had been securely locked from the inside. The door could not be opened from the outside. With no other option, the officers decided to force their way in. After kicking the door open, they were met by complete darkness inside the apartment. The officers cautiously stepped inside. After searching through the living room, dining area, kitchen, balcony, and other common areas, the officers found nothing. Only 2 bedrooms remained. When they opened the door to the guest bedroom, the officers discovered that it had been blocked by a mattress. It was obvious that someone had deliberately placed it there to prevent anyone from entering. However, this did not stop the police. After pushing the door open, they found no one inside. But they did discover several traces of blood on the headboard. At that moment, the officers realized that something terrible had happened. They immediately rushed to the master bedroom. The door was also locked from the inside. The officers kicked the door, but the entrance had been blocked by a mattress and other furniture, making it impossible to get inside. One of the officers shouted, "I know someone is in there." "We are the police." A man's deep voice came from behind the door. "I'm not coming out. The moment I step outside, you're going to attack me." The officers immediately realized that the man was Blake. If they forced their way inside, they feared he might panic and do something even more dangerous. So instead of rushing in, they tried to calm him down and began negotiating with him. An officer said, "We're only here to find Lana. That's all. You have nothing to worry about." Blake replied, "My girlfriend is sick. She's in the hospital nearby." He even provided what he claimed was her hospital bed number. Of course, the officers did not believe his story. But there was a problem. Blake refused to come out, and he refused to continue talking. With Lana's safety potentially at stake, the officers did not dare force their way into the room. The two sides reached a stalemate. At this point, a negotiator, the kind of specialist we often see in movies, was brought in. But surprisingly, the person chosen to negotiate with Blake was not a police negotiator. It was Green, Blake's friend and accountant. After a lengthy and friendly conversation with Green, Blake finally agreed to come out. When he emerged, he was wearing nothing but a pair of white underwear. He looked completely exhausted. There were scratches and bruises on the left side of his face, while his arms were covered with injuries that appeared to have been caused during a struggle. There were also clear bite marks on his left chin and left arm. It was obvious that he had been involved in a violent physical confrontation with someone. The police immediately took Blake into custody. They then entered the bedroom to search the scene. As soon as one of the officers stepped inside, he shouted, "She's in here." The person he was referring to was Lana. She was lying motionless on the bed. She was no longer breathing. The subsequent autopsy revealed an extraordinarily horrifying scene. Lana's body had almost no blood left. She had suffered catastrophic injuries to her head. A large portion of her scalp had been cut away, one of her ears was missing, and the remaining injuries were so severe that they were difficult even to describe. The cause of death was massive blood loss caused by severe trauma to the head, which had torn major arteries and veins. The forensic pathologist estimated that Lana had been dead for at least 10 hours. Investigators believed that after being attacked, she had remained alive and in agony for several hours. During that time, she was subjected to horrific torture. The brutality was so extreme that some comparisons were made to the infamous Black Dahlia case. Even the forensic pathologist was shocked by what he had seen. After decades working in the field, he said he had never encountered a case like this before. He believed that very few, if any, forensic pathologists or medical examiners anywhere in the world had ever seen injuries of this nature. It was an exceptionally brutal and extremely rare crime. Police also discovered large amounts of blood throughout the apartment. Blood was found on the mattress, headboard, carpets, towels, curtains, and inside the bathtub in the master bathroom. There were also bloodstains and strands of hair left behind in the bathtub. Inside the trash can, investigators found razors covered in blood and hair. All of these clues indicated that the apartment itself was the primary crime scene. Moreover, judging from the relatively small amount of blood remaining at the scene, investigators believed that someone had carefully cleaned the apartment after the murder. Using luminol, investigators detected large amounts of hidden blood on the carpet beside the bed in the master bedroom and in the bathroom. Based on the blood patterns and the fact that Lana's body had been almost completely drained of blood, investigators believed that she had been dragged between the bedroom and the bathroom, where she was ultimately drained of her blood. Police also discovered 11 garbage bags inside a public trash container outside the building. Each bag contained blood-soaked towels, bed sheets, and other materials. One of the bed sheets had a clearly visible bloody handprint. Investigators also found an ear and other human tissue among the discarded materials. After forensic testing, all of the blood and human tissue were confirmed to belong to Lana. As for the person responsible for this horrific crime, the evidence pointed unmistakably to her boyfriend, Blake. Although Blake had showered and cleaned himself after the attack, the bite marks on his body and the tissue found underneath his fingernails belonged to Lana. At the same time, tissue from Blake was found underneath Lana's fingernails, indicating that she had fought desperately for her life. Investigators also found a bloody right-hand fingerprint on one of the bedsheets. The print was missing part of the little finger, matching the fact that Blake's right little finger was also partially missing. Combined with the numerous other pieces of evidence collected at the scene, the case against Blake appeared overwhelming. But one question remained. Why? Why would Blake brutally and mercilessly torture the woman he claimed to love? What could have driven him to commit such a horrifying crime against his own girlfriend? Blake's full name was Blake Leibel. He was born in 1981 in Ontario, Canada. He was not an ordinary man. Blake's father, Lorne, was a prominent real estate developer in Canada. His real estate company had once been one of the country's most successful development firms. Lorne was also an accomplished sailor who had competed in the Olympics and had been inducted into the Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame. Blake's mother, Irene, came from a wealthy family that had founded a well-known plastics company. In other words, Blake was born into wealth. He had access to more money than he could possibly spend. But being born into a wealthy family did not mean his childhood was happy. When Blake was young, his parents' relationship deteriorated and they eventually separated. Blake stayed with his mother, while his older brother Cody lived with their father. Perhaps because of that separation, Blake never had a close relationship with his father. After graduating from college in 2004, Blake moved to Los Angeles. Although his family could provide him with a substantial amount of money, enough to live comfortably without ever having to work, Blake still wanted to build something of his own. Los Angeles had a thriving film industry, so Blake decided to pursue a career in entertainment. Fortunately, he was not without talent. From an early age, Blake had been fascinated by video games and comics. He also studied subjects related to those interests while at school. In 2008, Blake became involved in producing an animated television series called Spacebow. In 2009, he directed a comedy film titled Bull. Then, in 2010, he published a dark graphic novel called Sins of Rome. Blake's full name was Blake Leibel. He was born in 1981 in Ontario, Canada. He was not an ordinary man. Blake's father, Lorne, was a prominent real estate developer in Canada. His real estate company had once been one of the country's most successful development firms. Lorne was also an accomplished sailor who had competed in the Olympics and had been inducted into the Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame. Blake's mother, Irene, came from a wealthy family that had founded a well-known plastics company. In other words, Blake was born into wealth. He had access to more money than he could possibly spend. But being born into a wealthy family did not mean his childhood was happy. When Blake was young, his parents' relationship deteriorated and they eventually separated. Blake stayed with his mother, while his older brother Cody lived with their father. Perhaps because of that separation, Blake never had a close relationship with his father. After graduating from college in 2004, Blake moved to Los Angeles. Although his family could provide him with a substantial amount of money, enough to live comfortably without ever having to work, Blake still wanted to build something of his own. Los Angeles had a thriving film industry, so Blake decided to pursue a career in entertainment. Fortunately, he was not without talent. From an early age, Blake had been fascinated by video games and comics. He also studied subjects related to those interests while at school. During his years in Hollywood, Blake was far from idle. His career appeared to be flourishing, and he was gradually establishing himself as an emerging director and graphic novelist. His love life was just as eventful. The two quickly became a couple. Their friends, however, were not particularly supportive of the relationship. Amanda loved parties and socializing, while Blake preferred staying at home. Their personalities seemed completely incompatible. In 2011, Amanda became pregnant, and the two eventually got married. When their child was born, the baby brought some happiness to their small family. But the differences in their personalities, which had previously been overlooked, soon became impossible to ignore. In their daily lives, the couple argued frequently because they simply could not get along. Eventually, both began to realize that perhaps their friend's original concerns had been justified. Maybe they should never have been together in the first place. The couple eventually separated, although they did not immediately divorce. That same year, Blake's mother died of cancer, leaving behind an estate worth approximately $12 million. Blake expected to inherit a significant portion of his mother's fortune. But under her final will, he received only a few $1,000,000. Most of the estate was divided between his father and his brother. Blake was furious. He even suspected that his father had forged the will. Blake raised the issue, but eventually the matter faded away without a clear resolution. From that point on, he developed a deep resentment toward his father. The two became more like enemies than father and son. Around this same period, Blake met Lana, the Ukrainian model. Their relationship progressed extremely quickly. Blake deliberately concealed the fact that he was still married. When Lana eventually discovered the truth, Blake told her that he was already in the process of divorcing his wife. And this time, at least, that part was true. In July 2015, even though Amanda was pregnant again and close to giving birth, Blake finalized his divorce and moved out of their home. Then, in August, Lana became pregnant. Everything was moving incredibly fast. Lana soon moved into Blake's apartment in West Hollywood so that they could build a life together. She was extremely happy with the relationship because Blake seemed almost too perfect. He was wealthy, deeply affectionate, and showered her with expensive gifts. He bought her a Mercedes, a diamond ring, and provided her with a beautiful home. With their baby on the way, Lana believed that her future was finally secure. She had achieved the dream of getting married and having a child in America. In April 2016, Lana invited her mother, Olga, from Ukraine to Los Angeles to help take care of the baby. On May 3, Lana gave birth to their daughter, Diana. Wanting to give the young couple some privacy, Olga rented an apartment near her daughter's home so that she could still be close enough to help with the baby. At first, everything seemed perfect. But no one could have imagined what would happen just 2 weeks later. Lana contacted the police and accused Blake of forcing her to have sex with him. At first glance, this appeared to be the point where their relationship began to fall apart. However, investigators initially believed that this alone did not explain why Blake would murder Lana. Furthermore, Blake's friends insisted that he had never had a criminal record. They described him as a polite and respectable man who possessed an enormous fortune. Why would someone like that throw away his entire future? After the murder, Blake repeatedly denied committing the crime. He insisted that he was innocent and maintained that he had been falsely accused. He even claimed that science would eventually prove his innocence. But the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene pointed overwhelmingly in one direction. Blake was the killer. So what was the truth hiding beneath the surface? After conducting an extensive investigation, particularly by examining the conversations between Lana and her mother shortly before Lana's death, investigators began to uncover a very different side of Blake. He was not the good and respectable man his friends had described. In reality, both Blake and his brother Cody were heavily involved in gambling. Cody was the more serious gambler and could be considered a professional high-stakes gambler. At times, his individual bets could reach millions of dollars. There is a saying that in gambling, you can lose 9 out of 10 times. Cody was no exception. Eventually, he accumulated enormous gambling debts. Because of those debts, he also managed to anger some very dangerous people. Blake was even worried that his brother's gambling problems would eventually bring trouble to the entire family. But gambling was not Blake's only problem. He was also addicted to marijuana and other substances. He frequently lost his temper with both his ex-wife and his girlfriends, only to later beg for their forgiveness in strange and obsessive ways. During the final stages of Lana's pregnancy, their relationship became increasingly tense. This was one of the reasons Lana had invited her mother to Los Angeles. She valued the relationship deeply and hoped that spending more time together would help repair the growing cracks between her and Blake. But clearly, the plan did not work. Only days after Diana was born, Blake's mood deteriorated even further. He became extremely irritable and volatile. He would often pull the curtains shut, seal the windows, and smoke drugs around the clock inside the apartment until the entire place was filled with smoke. He showed little interest in his newborn daughter. In fact, he appeared to resent the baby. Blake believed that Diana had taken away Lana's attention and time, leaving him neglected. He became increasingly obsessed with his own needs and sexual desires. Only days after Lana gave birth, Blake forced her to have sex with him. He even openly threatened her. "If you don't satisfy me, I'll find another woman." And he did exactly that. Investigators later discovered that while Lana was pregnant, Blake was involved with 3 women at the same time. Besides his ex-wife Amanda, there was another woman named Boer Free. Boer Free told investigators that during her first date with Blake, he sexually assaulted her and transmitted a sexually transmitted infection to her. She subsequently filed a lawsuit against him. But incredibly, she later forgave Blake. The two even became secret lovers. To make it easier for them to continue their affair, Blake arranged for Boer Free to stay in another one of his properties. At the same time, he continued maintaining a close relationship with his ex-wife, Amanda. Lana's mother, Olga, later told police that although she had only been in Los Angeles for a short time, it took her just a few days of living around Blake to realize that he was extremely controlling and potentially dangerous. She urged her daughter to leave Blake and come live with her. But for some reason, Lana continued returning to him. Perhaps she truly did not want to give up on the relationship she had once believed was perfect. 2 days before her murder, Lana went shopping with her mother at a shopping mall. Neither of them could have known that Lana's life was about to come to a horrifying end. As soon as Lana received Blake's message, she immediately became anxious and went looking for him. No one could have imagined that it would be the last time anyone would ever see her alive. Lana disappeared completely. She would never come home again. Prosecutors argued that Blake's motive for the murder stemmed from jealousy and anger toward the baby. The birth of their child made Blake feel that he was losing control over Lana. As her attention shifted toward the newborn, his resentment grew, eventually leading to murderous thoughts. But was he truly so consumed by rage that he was willing to throw away his entire future just to kill his girlfriend? There was another troubling question. The brutality of the murder did not resemble the actions of an inexperienced killer. Instead, it appeared disturbingly similar to the methods of someone who had carefully studied violent crime. On this point, investigators soon found an answer. Remember how we mentioned that Blake was a graphic novelist? Back in 2010, he published a dark graphic novel called Sins of Rome. The book was extremely violent and disturbing. Its cover featured a mutilated doll, and the story began with the question: if you enjoy hurting other people, what would you do? It ended with the chilling line: in the end, we will all become monsters. The final page was accompanied by a crudely drawn image of a giant hand. Disturbingly, the details of Lana's death closely resembled scenes depicted in Blake's graphic novel. One illustration showed a woman lying on a blood-soaked bed with her scalp completely removed. The similarities were difficult to ignore. Blake's friends also revealed that he had been fascinated by crime-related subjects since childhood, particularly dark stories involving murder and violence in Hollywood. Whether through films, stories, or his own novels, Blake repeatedly explored these disturbing themes. Investigators believe that another possible motive for the murder was Blake's desire to turn the horrific ideas from his own fiction into reality. And Blake appeared to have carefully planned his escape. After the murder, he meticulously cleaned the apartment and hid approximately $4,000 in cash and his passport inside his pants. Had Olga not remained persistent and repeatedly contacted the police, Blake might have managed to escape to Canada. In June 2018, nearly 2 years after the murder, the case that had shocked Hollywood and generated widespread discussion finally went to trial. What was difficult to believe was how different Blake looked when he appeared in court. He had gained a considerable amount of weight and looked noticeably heavier, suggesting that he had been living relatively comfortably while awaiting trial in custody. But his position had not changed. Just as he had from the moment of his arrest, Blake continued to insist that he was innocent. During the proceedings, he even claimed to have a mental illness in an attempt to delay the trial. However, after being examined by psychiatrists, he was determined to be mentally competent and fully capable of standing trial. The trial lasted 6 days. Prosecutors called a total of 14 witnesses and presented extensive physical evidence linking Blake to the crime. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors told the court that Blake's actions were exceptionally evil and that the level of violence he had inflicted was almost impossible to put into words. It was, they argued, something that was difficult to comprehend as a human act. They also argued that Blake had planned the horrific murder using ideas inspired by his own graphic novel, Sins of Rome. A forensic pathologist testified that the case represented an extraordinary level of brutality, with the severity of Lana's injuries being unlike anything he had previously encountered. On June 26, the jury took only 3 hours to reach a verdict. The judge declared Blake guilty of first-degree murder, along with several other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When Olga heard the verdict, she broke down in tears. It was the moment she had been waiting for so long. She would often hold photographs of her daughter and cry. "I'm sorry, my child. I couldn't save you." There was another painful detail. Although Blake came from a wealthy and prominent family, only his brother Cody appeared in court throughout the trial. The rest of his family seemed to have distanced themselves from him, apparently deeply disappointed by what he had done. The question of where Diana would live also became a major issue. As Blake's daughter, she could potentially inherit part of his fortune. But ultimately, her grandmother Olga was granted custody. Before her death, Lana had wanted her daughter to grow up in America. However, after losing her daughter, Olga could no longer afford to maintain a life in the United States. She eventually took Diana back to Ukraine, where she could raise her granddaughter. Later, in a civil lawsuit against Blake, a judge ordered him to pay Olga approximately $41.6 million in damages for the loss of her daughter and the costs associated with raising her granddaughter. However, Olga said that she had not received that compensation. There were later reports that Blake's family chose to settle the matter privately with Olga. The two sides reportedly reached a financial agreement, although the exact amount was never disclosed. In the end, I can't help but think that Lana's tragedy might have been prevented. Her mother had sensed that something was wrong from the very beginning. When Olga first called the police, the timing may have been close to the period when forensic investigators later estimated that Lana was attacked. There is a possibility that Lana was still alive at that point. Unfortunately, the situation was not treated with enough urgency, and a critical opportunity to save her life may have been lost. There is another disturbing detail. During the struggle with Blake, Lana fought desperately and screamed for help. In interviews conducted afterward, several neighbors said they had heard a woman's screams. But they did not call the police. They chose to remain silent. That detail reminds me of another case I previously covered, the horrific abuse and murder of a domestic worker in Singapore. In that case, indifference and the failure of people around her to intervene also robbed the victim of a chance to be rescued. She was eventually subjected to horrific abuse and died tragically. Lana's case ultimately ended with a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. But even that punishment seemed incapable of easing the enormous pain suffered by her family, especially her mother and her young daughter, who was left without her mother. This story is not simply about a murder. It is also a warning about many issues that exist in our society today. It forces us to ask: can money and fame really buy happiness? Blake was born with almost everything a person could possibly want. Yet he ultimately lost himself in a destructive cycle of gambling, substance abuse, and unhealthy desires. The tragedy also makes us think about the frightening indifference of the people around us. Lana's cries for help went unanswered. The warning signs were overlooked. The silence of her neighbors, and perhaps even the delays in the response of the authorities, whether intentional or not, may have indirectly contributed to the tragedy. That is why, more than ever, we need to learn to pay greater attention to the people around us. Sometimes, a simple question, a few words of concern, or a small act of kindness can make the difference between life and death. We should never allow indifference to turn us into bystanders in the face of someone else's suffering. This story also reminds us that abuse is not limited to physical violence. It can take many forms, including psychological control, manipulation, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and other forms of coercion. We need to remain alert to even the smallest warning signs of abuse. And we should never be afraid to speak up or seek help, whether for ourselves or for someone we love. Most importantly, I believe that character and moral education should always come first. Whether someone is rich or poor, it is compassion, kindness, and a sense of responsibility toward others that truly define what it means to be a good human being. Lana's story is a heartbreaking tragedy, an irreversible loss that can never truly be compensated for. But I hope her story will not remain merely a sad tale. I hope it can also become a lesson for all of us, to live better, to love more deeply, and to protect the people we care about. I hope that none of us will choose to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. Because sometimes, silence can become a form of complicity. That's all for today's video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.